afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Zahn Academy. Today's webinar is 3Shape Design Pro Tips. And I have Matt Vines with me today, who is the supervisor for high-tech training at Zahn Dental. And he was kind enough to put together this pro tip denture design course for us. So I hope you guys will enjoy it. Today, we have some polls that we'd like to launch so that this could be an interactive webinar, and Matt will, get to know who his attendees are and be able to kind of tailor this to your needs. So I'll be launching our first poll momentarily, and we will have a live Q&A at the very end as well. So get your questions ready, and you can type them in at the bottom of your screen. So I want to thank you all for joining us here, and I'm going to turn this over to Matt, and I will launch that first poll.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us today as we go and explore the 3Shape Denture design pro tips that we figured out for you guys. The focus areas that we really want to kind of describe right now are these areas that kind of take up a lot of time during the denture design process. And it's really where we kind of want to kind of bring in the details and figure out how can we speed up these areas to get our denture designs more effective and efficient, and also see what actually goes behind these individual steps to kind of see what those can relate to our denture design and how we can manipulate those a little bit better to be successful. So as you can see, the first poll is up. It's just asking us which one you'd be more excited to learn about here. So here we have on the screen, we do have the tooth extraction tools, which is talking about how we can remove existing teeth from our denture design scans and get that ready for an immediate low denture. Next one's going to be talking about that spline line manipulation. So whether we're designing the base outline or if we're going and adjusting the gingiva settings, however you want to talk about it, there's many different splines within the denture design process. And so knowing how to utilize and how to manipulate those splines with the different additive features that we have there allows us to be a little bit more efficient with that. Then we're going to talk about the teeth manipulation tools, which is going to be the largest area that we spend on with our denture design. It's talking about how we set up the teeth, whether it's manipulating the anteriors or the posteriors, getting the contacts properly, whether we're in a class 1 bite or a class 3, adjusting that cant and kind of design of the teeth overall. And then we're going to also talk about opening and modifying the bite. So utilizing that virtual articulator that 3Shape has available to us and making sure that we can manipulate that to be successful based upon what the doctor recommends, but also utilize it in a fashion that allows us to see the articulation of our designs and how that will kind of go about in the patient's mouth as well. Then we can talk about the gingiva design settings. So there's many different aspects that we have to gingiva design, whether that's talking about the stippling that we have available to us, or it's adding on those additional friction bars for the printing process, or if we're going to be casting it. If you wanted to do this for like RPDs, we can go ahead and show you similar aspects that allow us to go ahead and add these features onto the denture-based design. And then we're going to talk about the coupling and socket step, the settings that we have available to that, how we can alleviate the issues that we see within that step. So a lot of times we come up across errors that might be hindering us or preventing us from moving forward. So just taking a look at the settings on those steps allows us to go ahead and see what we can do to change that. And like I said, alleviate those errors from happening. And then finally, taking a look at the fitment or the manufacturing settings, so we kind of determine what kind of fit we're expecting to see, and if we need to make any adjustments with that. And we'll go ahead and make those in the software as well, but we can also make them behind the scenes on the control panel, so it allows us to be a little bit more effective going forward.
So Matt, I can give you the results of this poll.
Sure.
So it seems that most people are interested in the gingiva design. And
Perfect.
that was 75%. The other 25% that answered, they want to see teeth manipulation tools.
Yeah, those are probably the two heaviest topics that we're going to talk about, but I do want to show and utilize these other tools we have within the denture design process. So we're going to start from the top and we'll work our way down. And any questions that come along the way, we'll go ahead and tackle those. If you could just let me know that they have a question, and we'll kind of tackle it as is, but we can also do a more formal Q&A at the end too. Okay. So first what we're going to do is we're going to open up a case that I already have queued up for us, which is going to be this case here. And this is going to be one that we've set up so it has an existing dentition on the upper arch. And so we're going to plan to remove those dentition from our scans and prepare an immediate low denture on there. So when we first come into the denture design process, you'll see that it skips over the first two sections in our main navigation bar at the top here. The first one's going to be the order form, but the one that it typically skips over because it accepts that the scans are already prepared in this fashion is the prepare stage. So we can actually go back a step at this point, and this brings us to different tools that we might not have been aware of, but are definitely available to us and can definitely be utilized in a fashion that helps us to alleviate issues within the scan. So say if our model had any sort of striations or bubbles that we wanted to get rid of, we can use the wax knife settings that we might be used to in the crown design stage, and we can utilize those in a fashion that helps us to kind of mask or fix those errors within the denture scans that we have available. So this one, I'm actually going to be looking at the operative upper jaw here. So I'm going to talk about how we can utilize some of the tools in our toolkit here to remove all the teeth that we see before us. So like I said, we can go about and utilize the wax knife in a fashion that we know about, and we could, smooth it all out and get it to an area that looks like the final design that we're looking for, or the final ridge that we're looking for. But we do also have a remove artifacts and a teeth extraction tool, which is really huge at this point. And the tooth extraction tool allows us to go ahead and highlight individual teeth that we would like to remove. And as soon as we click from the occlusal view, it gives us a green spline that we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth later. But we can go ahead and manipulate this, and anything that's covered in red will go ahead and be removed. So I'm just going to go ahead and quickly adjust this spline around the bottom base of the tooth here. I know I can do this in a faster fashion, but I'm just going to use this right now with the dots here. And then if I hit the play button, it's going to go ahead and remove that tooth from being operated on or being a part of our scan at this point. So now you can see that it goes ahead and it finds an average based upon that spline. It finds an average of that area and develops that in a sort of generalized pattern or generalized plane that it utilizes for the scan. Now, the caveat when doing this is we don't want to select the whole arch when we change this. So if I were to change this to a fast edit line, if I go ahead and I select this whole arch here, just give it a moment here. It's yelling at me because it has some areas outside of the arch. What happens when we have the whole arch selected like this? Make some just like adjustment changes here. Is if we take into consideration what it did with a single tooth, where it finds that average or that median between the individual vertices of this spline, essentially what it's going to do is it's going to take that into consideration for this whole spline here. And while that may be nice to get rid of them effectively, efficiently right off the bat as one whole giant piece, it doesn't really present itself in a nice fashion as far as actual calculations go, because we'll see instead of having a nice smooth transition all along this base or all along this ridge that we utilize for that immediate denture load, it would actually kind of suck down a little bit more in depth than we wanted to, and might create something in the middle here and kind of cap off this space that we need specifically for that denture base. So if I hit play, you'll see it's trying to grab from both areas. So from both this buccal side to this buccal side, and actually creates this sort of artifact all around. So this would not be acceptable as far as the proper utilization of this tool. So instead, what we do is you kind of want to go one at a time here. And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to click on one tooth at a time and then play. And if you click on it from the top, it does a pretty good job as far as identifying what it needs to. It might need some adjustments. So we're going to go ahead and make minor adjustments just by utilizing that fast edit line, or a fast edit spline as it's called. And we're just going to skip every other tooth. And like I said, it's going to go ahead and kind of gradually find a happy medium between two. But then once we've gone and we skip that tooth, now we can go in between those two and be a little bit more successful within our breach of what we're looking for as far as the ridge goes. So we can do it a little bit more one at a time here if we wanted to. Or we could skip every other one. and just gradually removing the tooth from the process here allows us to go ahead and estimate that that medial denture ridge as if we just extracted these in the mouth. Okay, and once we use this feature, oh, so I see did miss that portion right there. Go ahead and look at it a little bit more vertically here. Adjust my spline as needed. And I can make changes to this afterwards as well. So once I've made this major change of just extracting the tooth from the plane here, I can then utilize my wax knife tools again, like the smooth, the add, and the subtract, to get a real more refined ridge. I'm just going to go ahead and smooth that out. So for instance, something like this, I could either utilize this again and try to take that down, or I can use the smooth tool later on to really get a nice finalized finished. Play. And I'm just going along, clicking on the top of the tooth and just assuming that it's going to select properly. But if I see that there's a lot of indications or a lot of topography within the tooth, you can see that the automatic selection doesn't do that great of a job. So just kind of keeping that in mind and being mindful to look at your spline to see where it's actually encapsulating allows us to go ahead and utilize this just a little bit more effectively. Okay, this might be a little bit longer than I expected to take for this process, but it is relatively quick as opposed to going through the wax knife tools just individually and expecting that to take change on all the teeth that we're looking to manipulate. All right, so I've made my changes. I've removed all my teeth from here. You can see I still have a bumpy ridge, so at this point I just go back to the smoothing tool. And since we know it's just going to be an immediate denture, we don't have to be precise with this, but we just have to have an idea of where that ridge might be sitting. And that's just taking into consideration the digital extraction of the teeth is just representing if those teeth weren't there to begin with. So it's not going to be an exact replication of there, but it gives us a good starting point to go off of and work off of. Alternatively, I don't want to leave these sharp edges during this process. So if I just remove the teeth and move forward with the design process, we would run into a lot of errors as far as the gingiva or the base creation goes, because those sharp areas tend to cause issues as far as the software goes for calculating that sort of instance in that area. Okay, so I may have been a little bit high here. I can go ahead and utilize my subtraction tool, just kind of remove a little bit more excess material over here. Just be a little bit more free and clear of any obstacles. So there we go. Now, utilizing that first step, we do have the option to go back into this prepare stage, which allows us to open up this sculpt toolkit to adjust or manipulate the actual scans that are coming in. So like I said, if you had any sort of bubbles or any sort of defects in the scans, you can go ahead and correct those here. So if we had any areas that we're looking to kind of correct, we can correct those here. If there is anything on the papilla, so if there's anything on the insides of the papilla that was either like a pull or something like that, you can go ahead and correct it in here with this toolkit as well. And also if there's some sort of defect on the rugae, you can go ahead and move that here. Or if you wanted to add it in, you could use the add tool to add it in as well. So next on our list, that's the teeth extraction tools. It's just over here in the tooth sculpt toolkit. Sorry, it's called tooth extraction tool, and it just allows us to go ahead and select an indication or a tooth that we have on our scan and remove it from there for digital extraction and kind of replicate something similar to a ridge that we would see as far as that averaging out goes. Okay. So next, what we're going to talk about in our line was the spline line manipulations. So this goes back more towards the next step. If we had, again, brings us back to the next sculpting on the lower jaw at this point. But if we go back into the proper workflow that we're looking for as far as the denture design point goes, the first thing that we do is we mark the occlusal plane, and then we mark the characteristic points, and then we draw our boundaries. Okay. And just like we saw here, where we were manipulating that red line or that green line around the teeth during the extraction process, we're also going to be having that spline during the boundary process, which you might all be familiar with. So real quick, I'm just going to mark my tuberosity, my central point, and my other tuberosity, and then I'm going to go ahead and put my canine points out there. I'm just going to set this up. Buccal, lingual, central ridge points, lingual, and my canines. So at this point, we would draw our boundaries where we can utilize that spline. And because I didn't have the idealized full scan on this case, we're not going to truly see the exact boundary of our denture design, but the line will still manipulate the same way, even though my scans may not be perfect. So during this process, we're going to go through and just mark out an idealized location for our spline. If we had any sort of soft tissue, where the soft tissue meets the hard tissue, if we had any sort of ligaments or anything in there that we wanted to kind of skip over, you definitely want to go up and over those. You don't want them to be included into the actual denture base here. So you can see here that I may not have been perfect with my exact design or my spline line, and I do have options that we can utilize to manipulate the spline to get it to the exact boundary that we're looking for. Right off the bat, we do have an option to utilize these blue dots, which we see here, which are the individual points that we have available to us. We can go ahead and left click on those dots, and if you left click on it and hold down, you'll see that it's highlighted yellow, indicating that we're going to be moving that. And you can either move that upwards and downwards or forwards and backwards based upon the view that we're looking at. Now we can also remove points from being added on this line. So if I wanted it to be a little bit more straight between these 2 points, I could right click on the dot and hit delete point. And that allows me to create a nice straight line in between these 2 dots. Alternatively, I can also right click on a blank space where there is no dot and click the add point to add more additional features there. So this is where you can get really customized and really get in those characteristic points of our spline here. Another way that we have is we also have what's called the fast edit spline, which removes the dots. So the dots are physically there for us to see, but it allows us to go ahead and instead of left clicking and dragging on a dot, we can left click and drag on the line similar to how we drew it in the first place. This is great for making nice changes that you can see, but don't want to create multiple dots. It allows us to go ahead and create multiple angles without having to create multiple dots. So it's a little bit faster in that aspect. But it's a little bit less accurate because we're now relying upon a smooth move of our mouse hand to manipulate that line. If we jump across and have any sort of hiccup or sneeze during that process, you can see that it's going to take note of that. All right, we do have an opportunity to bring that back in just by going through where we want the line to be, so long as that change is not very big. So if this change kind of went over like this, and I try to draw this over here, it should correct itself in that area. But if that change is larger than the change that we're looking to manipulate, what happens is it might inverse that spline. So in that case, you might have to delete the spline, which is just right clicking and deleting the spline. You'll notice that when we move to the fast edit spline, we no longer have options to delete or add points. Like I said, they're just visual factors here, so we don't have the opportunity to move them. But if we wanted to see those again, we could right click on it and see that it actually added a lot more blue dots, where I utilize that because it's a little bit more smoother, it has more contact points over here. But I can simply bring those back in by right clicking on the dot or right clicking on the line. Another neat feature that we don't see utilized a lot is the show local cross section. And this allows us to go ahead and see the height of contour relative to that individual point here. So here you can see if we brought it out to the edge, you can kind of see this black line that's appearing over here. And if we wanted to bring it up to the height of contour, you would go ahead and bring it up to the height of contour, which starts to drag back down, and then see exactly where you want that dot to sit. So in this case, if we're drawing it around the valley area where the border molding would be, we would typically be in sort of U shape or a valley aspect, and we kind of bring that down into that individual area. So this is a great kind of surveying tool for somebody that's not really familiar with the denture design process and they don't know where that boundary meets, or it's not very clear to them. You can utilize this in a fashion that allows them to kind of see exactly where that should be based upon the contour of our 3D scan at that point. Okay, and I think that's all. This might not have been the greatest case to start it off with because it's so round. Maybe we go ahead and we take a look at what this looks like on the lower jaw boundary, because we might have a little bit more topography to play with and be able to see more features. So here I can automatically see exactly where I want my boundary to be. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of draw it as I want to. Now I can draw it like it did the last one, just by left clicking and dragging it. But again, it requires a steady hand and it might not be best for everybody that's starting out with denture design process. A cool thing with the spline line manipulation is you also have an opportunity just to click dots. So those of us who may have had too much coffee that morning and our hands shaking and we can't get a straight line with that spline line, we can go ahead and utilize this fashion, which is a little bit slower, but allows us to be a little bit more accurate in where we want to place that line. So here I can go a little bit more in detail, all right, around this ligament here. And then I can go ahead and open it up and be a little bit more broader with there. And the more dots you add, the more precise it's going to be, but it's going to be a little bit more tedious as far as the clicks that you're doing. Okay. Now, once we don't have that that local cross section that I just talked about, we don't have that during this process here, because we have to facilitate a line to start with, and then any edits from there on, we will have that opportunity to utilize that. So I'm going to go ahead and purposely move a dot up here. If I do place it out of place, I'm not going to try to left click and drag this into the location. I'm just going to continue from where I left off as if I didn't make that mistake, and then just move forward to where I want it to be. And then we can know that with those additional features that we have on the spline line, we can fix that later. Okay. I'm just going to go ahead and close this out by clicking on the first dot that we started with. And now I can go ahead and address that issue. So again, I'm going to show the local cross section to see what that looks like. And now I can see as I drag this down, you can almost see exactly where that border is right over here. So we're going to go ahead and draw that right there. You can see that's the lowest point. So this is a great idea or a great tool to utilize for people that aren't really familiar with finding these specific areas, but allowing them to be as accurate as possible, as accurate as the scans allow us to be based upon the information that we've captured. Okay, so that's it for the spline line manipulation. The next thing that we're going to talk about is the teeth manipulation tools, which again, a lot of you want to see, as well as the gingiva design. So I'm going to go ahead and hopefully that picks up there. Let's look at our next case that we have here, which is going to be the initial setup or the tooth manipulation tools. So ideally, this is going to be something that when you pick your library is going to be suited exactly for the setup that you have based upon the characteristic points that we chose and the initial setup of our sagittal plane and our occlusal plane that we did in the first stage here. But we do have many different tools along with our setup tools. So the first thing that we're going to talk about, not just the tools, but the actual library selection tool here. And these are the different brands of libraries that we have available to us. And then they're going to be the ones that you have options to go ahead and utilize during the design process. Whether or not those individual brands allow for individual tooth manipulation is based upon their availability to either allow you to manufacture your own teeth or require you to buy their teeth, like their carded teeth, which in that case, you wouldn't be able to do any manipulation as far as the actual scaling or rotating, or not this rotating, the scaling or the broadening of the tooth itself. But you can still manipulate the tooth as far as its direction and its placement inside of the sockets. So we do have options for that. But here we do see different libraries that we have available to us. If we wanted to show just full arch libraries, this would just show us the cases that just have full arch libraries. So here we could cycle through full libraries that are kind of combined together. And that way it chooses the anteriors at the same time that it chooses your posterior libraries. And we do have an opportunity, which I'll talk about after we chose the full arch libraries, is we do have an opportunity to utilize just single posterior libraries or change the posterior libraries based upon your liking. So if you wanted the left side to be a little bit more different than the right side, a little bit more characterized, you can choose different aspects based upon that. And each time that we choose a library, it has a specific code that's relative to that manufacturer, but it has the details as far as the tooth actual size. So here we can see that the distance between the posteriors from the most distal to the most mesial aspect is going to be 36.4 millimeters wide. And you can see on the upper, it's going to be 33.60. And then again, we also have the overall occlusal table of 9.90 and 10.30. So if you know exactly what kind of setup you're looking for, you can adjust that along here. The only thing that the individual libraries are not set up for are the multiple classes that we have of different bites. So they're all going to be set up ideally towards an idealized class 1 bite, an idealized occlusion. But we do have opportunities with these other tools to make those different changes to be what we want it to be. So for this instance, I'm just going to choose the Dentsply Digital highly characterized Genius library, because I like that one a lot. It has a little bit more characteristics to it. And I'm just going to go ahead and use the apply button to apply that to here. But here we can cycle through and see different anteriors. We can see, like I said, the different posteriors. We can want a different posterior on the left or right side. We can choose that. But I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply. It's going to change my library out. It shouldn't change too much because I think I already had this set up. But the next step is we're going to talk about the individual tools that we have in our tool set that allow us to manipulate the individual teeth that we saw after our library selection. So the first one is going to be your global transformation. This is similar to the crown and bridge design where we have our global transformation tool, where we can make adjustments to the teeth as a group. So we can either drag them up or drag them down. We can also drag them left to right with the blue arrows that we see here, or based upon your view, you can just left click and drag it out. I'm actually going to hide this real quick just so we can see it a little bit better. Alternatively, we do have the red icons, which allows us, the red arrows allow us to rotate. So red rotate is a good nominator for that. I'm doing the changes that I've done so far. Additionally, we do have an opportunity, like I said, if we have the availability within the library to manipulate the size of the teeth, whether that's scaling it up or scaling it down, we do have these green dots available, but this is only if we have the opportunity to make those manipulations within the library. If we're using carded teeth, we don't have this option available to us. So here we can either bring them in and narrow down a little bit, or we can widen it out and make it a little bit more customized. Or we can also make them taller too. So if we had too much of a size to work with, we can go ahead and make our teeth a little bit taller and larger, fill up that gap a little bit more, and make it a little bit less gummy as far as the dentures go. We can bring that up. As we make these changes, be sure that and be mindful that you're always looking around and rotating your different views, because some of these tools, which we'll talk about in the next one and the other one over here, are going to change based upon your view. They're going to be able to manipulate certain aspects of the teeth based upon how we're looking at the tooth. So a lot of the dentures, if you make changes to it, you can see that it tends to bring them too much into contact here. So I'm going to undo all those changes that I've done so far. Just going to choose a different library here and just reset it. But another option that we have during this point, if we have libraries that are conflicting on those anterior areas where we want to see our overjet, we can see that by using our 2D cross-section tool, which allows us to measure that area. So by default, the cases should automatically line up in an area that idealizes the posterior occlusion and gives you an overjet based upon the amount that the library is set up for. So I think that might have been too much based upon my anteriors here. So I'm just going to bring it down just a little bit. And again, you can play around with that with the individual library selections, or we can change those designs based upon the tools that we have here. So if we don't have that setting how we like it to be, I'm going to show you how we can change that utilizing the tools here. So now it looks like a little bit too close and it looks like it's unhappy as far as its setting it here. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the next tool. If I try to change it in here, you can see that it doesn't change because we're utilizing that group function. So now we have to talk a little bit more individualized or changing the arch overall. If we use the arch selection tool, we do have two options right off the bat, which is symmetric design, which is whatever I do to the right-hand side is going to take effect and change on the left-hand side, which is kind of good to keep you in line, but might not be idealized as far as what we're looking for. And then showing overlaps. So here you can see your overbite and your overjet, which is a good opportunity to allow us to go ahead and manipulate that and see what those settings would be. So here my overbite looks a little bit too much, and my overjet may be nice if it were a little bit more on this side over here. So I'm going to go ahead, and with this tool, you'll notice if I click on one tooth, it gives me the individual changes that we can do here by moving it left or right, but it also changes its total mirror based upon that sagittal plane that we had set up. So if I make changes over here, it's also going to make changes to that other one there. Okay. Additionally, if I move this tooth out, it tends to want to create those contacts in between those areas to bring them to suck them together. So if they're too far out, they'll bring them together and suck them together. If they're too far in, it'll also push them out so that the contacts are correct. But this will only do this for the anterior stage. It won't do it for the posterior stage. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but I'm going to utilize this just to go ahead and see if I can't create or can't correct this with the arch setup. Now, if I didn't want to correct this side, if I just wanted to correct one side at all, I can go ahead and uncheck the symmetrical design and just affect just that one side here. Okay. Now, once I make that change, you can see it brought it back out to be in contact with my other teeth. So I can go ahead and bring this out, and you'll see it brings it back into contact. So you kind of have to be careful with this tool. It's a little finicky. It's great to work around, but once you bring it into too far away from a contact, it tends to mess up the contact points between the individual teeth, because you can see here it doesn't recognize that these individual papillas have to be kind of aligned in a certain area. It just recognizes that this tooth has to be contacted with this other tooth. So leaving it in this position, it knows that the tooth is contacting, so it's satisfying that restriction as far as the tool goes. But ideally, that does not look like an idealized setup. So you kind of have to be careful with that being a restriction of this tool. Okay. So I do like to leave the symmetrical design on. So anytime I do make one change, it does make the other changes appear as well. But another piece with this tool that we'll talk about is the opportunity to move posteriors. And you'll see if I go on the posterior region, if I click and drag it, still selected on that one tooth. Let me select off here real quick. There we go. If I click and drag on the posterior, still changing my overjets, I apologize here. If I click and drag the posterior, you'll see that the posterior is locked. And the reason why that is locked is because the individual libraries have it set up for idealized conclusion in the posterior section. So the lock of these teeth will be set up by your library, and you'll notice that it does not allow me to kind of remove this too far from the contact, because again, once I let go, it's going to make that change and bring it back into contact here. So we cannot really manipulate or change the individual contact points with this tool, but we can do that in a later version or a later tool that we have here. But just know that because if you're trying to manipulate just the posterior in this fashion, if you're not able to do it based upon either your view or the selection that we have, it's because most posteriors are locked. Now, an opportunity that we do have, if I can turn this down, is if we grab on the back here, if we grab on the most distal aspect of our posterior bridge, we do have an option to hinge, okay? And that allows us to go ahead and manipulate that back portion while still maintaining that idealized occlusion. So here we can go ahead and align this up based upon those guidelines that we had previously. And again, if I didn't want a symmetrical design, I can go ahead and drag this out and make it a little bit more direct in that area. So that's a really nice tool that we can utilize to get really close, but we have to be careful of the restrictions that it has, specifically when we come and looking at our overbite and our overjet features over here. Okay. The next tool that we honestly don't really utilize a lot, but it does get overlooked, is this alignment tool. It works much in the same way that the arch tool does set up, and you'll notice it actually doesn't even have any characteristics if you hover over it. But the arch tool works in the same way, where we can just go ahead and make changes, but this time it's not going to bring it back into contact. So it's a little bit more freedom as far as our design goes, but now we're not going to have that interproximal contact with the individual teeth. So we don't know exactly how that's going to look as far as setup. So we have to be careful with the utilization of that tool. I feel like much the same tools and manipulations can be done with this tool as can be done with the other one. So again, we can utilize symmetric designs. So we can either bring those out or we can pull these in. But we don't have those restrictions that we had prior. Okay. Pull these in. So again, it's not noticing any context. It's not bringing those contexts anymore. But it does allow us to make those changes that we see that might needed to be done. We can make those changes without those sort of hindrances of the locks or of the changes that we had previously in the previous tool here. Okay, and this tool kind of when you work on an individual, it works pretty nice. But if you just try to change the whole posterior, it doesn't really work that well. You don't get the opportunity you do have, which this next tool has, which is the individual setup. So the individual setup is very much similar to crown and bridge design if you had an individual tooth setup. So you had the global transitions, which allows to change the overarching combination of the teeth together. Or now we have an individualized setup that allows to go ahead and click on individual teeth here and make specific changes just to this individual tooth. So here I can utilize the blue options to either drag it down or drag it up. I can utilize the green options to widen it or make it thicker. If I look at it from a different view, I'm pulling out on the buckle. Okay. Again, symmetric design is allowing any change that takes place on this in this tooth is also applying across the arch over here as well. We can make some arch angle changes. So if you want these to be less prominent, you can go ahead and do that. And then the last change that we have available to us is the yellow, which is similar to the behavior of the green dot that we saw here. But instead of changing the whole width of the tooth, it has more of effect, more of a change on the inside ledge. So we can kind of increase the taper of this individual tooth. Okay. Next is going to be the individual morphing, which you should all know is very similar to the anatomy design, where we have an opportunity to go ahead and manipulate this even further by either pushing in or pushing out certain areas. We can use our control key to left click and drag out certain areas in a 2D plane or a 2D dimension, I guess you'd say, in or out, as opposed to a 3D manipulation, which you might see with this blue or gray sphere that you see here. Okay, so the morph tool, if you guys want to see more on that, we can definitely go over that as well. But this is an opportunity to just go ahead and characterize the teeth ever so much a little bit more. Okay, you'll notice that this one does not have the opportunity to do symmetric designs. So if we wanted it to take place or take the same changes on this side, we would have to do that manually and kind of eyeball it here. One thing I do want to talk about at this point is the contacts. So here I'm going to go ahead and just show you what the contacts look like. I'm going to remove that plane there too. So anywhere that you see on here that has like a bright red or a bright orange is going to be close to, or if not in contact. Anywhere that you see is dark or it has a blue area is too much contact. So we know that the tooth is actually impeding each other in these certain areas. So that means that we're going to have to take a look at these areas and be really concerned as far as that goes. So what we'll have to do is we'll have to go back and see what our occlusion looks like with the opposing teeth on. And you can see that this cuspid is coming way too far in. So I might go into the individual transformations and just utilize this just a little bit to customize that occlusion and then take a look. I can even turn this down a little bit so I can see what the occlusion looks like on the opposing and watch it change in real time here. Okay. So that one looks good, but maybe I have to tilt it just a little bit so much. Minimize that point of contact. I can also at this time utilize my morphing tool and just get a smaller circle and just work on that individualized area. Turn off this tooth here. I'm just going to utilize this just a little bit and just kind of pull this back and customize that tooth. Okay, so we can make those changes either by the big changes or we can do it with the morphing tool, which is a more subtle change that we have here. Alternatively, I could also just use this and scrunch this down. And again, this is only available to us if we have the opportunity within the library to do individualized or local manufacturing of the teeth. So if you're able to print your teeth or mill your teeth, this is only going to be available to you if you do that. Okay, so if we have our teeth all set up, the next thing that I want to talk about in the teeth manipulation, or part of that, was talking about opening or modifying the bite. So if we came into an instance where we ran into our design did not have enough room in the posterior region, we can do one of two things. We can either ask the doctor to open up the bite and allow us to open it up 5 millimeters or 3 millimeters, or we can do another option that I forgot to talk about, which was when you go to the individual tooth transformation tool, if you right click on it, you have different options within our menu to either bring it to individual contacts, where we can bring it into mesial contact, or we can bring it into contact with the antagonist, which is opposing contact. Or we can even remove second molars or remove individual teeth based upon the right click, if you right click on the individual tooth. So for this one, we can either remove all second molars on this side or remove all second molars or second premolars on the whole arch, and give us a little bit more space so we can move everything up more abruptly if we wanted to. And we can also lock the lower jaw and then work on the upper as if we're working against an antagonist too. So we do have an opportunity to do that. But if we wanted to adjust the bite in a way that kind of gives us a little bit more freedom or more space in here, what we would do is we would go over to the virtual articulator. The virtual articulator opens up another kind of animation or process within the design software that allows us to go ahead and test for excursions or movements within the mouth. So we can go through the protrusions or intrusions of the mouth here and kind of see what our design looks like as far as that goes. We also have an opportunity to change the relationship of the jaws into each other, in the relationship to each other. So here I can see that my jaws have plenty of space, but let's just take it if we didn't have enough space here. What we could do is we can go back to the modify the alignment of the jaws, and we can make the jaws, adjust the jaws manually over here. Okay, we can do that by hand, but that's not going to really be indicative of the proper movement. So I'm going to undo that change, and we're going to go back into the settings here. And we can do it a little bit more effectively and more efficiently by utilizing the RTEX, the ACR RTEX option here. And then we can change in our details as if we want them here. And we also have an opportunity to open up the incisal pin. So basically choosing one of the virtual articulators that has this incisal pin opening allows us to go ahead and adjust that bite based upon those condyle inclinations that we had set up here. So if we know those condyle inclinations, so if we say like the Bennett angles for the left and right were 15 on the left and 16 on the right based upon the information that the doctor gives us, we can go ahead and plug those in here and be a little bit more successful with our relationship as far as the opening goes, and more true to what the customer needs or what the customer's actual change would be. Okay, so I'm just going to change this to 32. No, not 32 available, please. All right, so now I've changed and I made those adjustments to here. You can actually, I don't know if you saw that change take place over here, but now if I open up the pin, it's going to be precise to the settings that we had preset here. So now I'm going to go ahead and open it up 3 millimeters. And you'll see that it opened up 3 millimeters along the actual articulation of the articulator. So it's not just opening it up or opening up the jaws in relation to each other 3 millimeters. It's actually opening it up as if we saw the patient opening up their mouth 3 millimeters. And so we can go ahead and make that change and save it. And once we save it, it's going to ask us that if once we change this bite, we can't go back. So in this case, I'm going to say okay. And we can utilize that. Now we can go back into our teeth manipulation tools. So we can turn off the virtual articulator. We can go back into those tools and make those changes and make those adjustments based upon that newfound aspect. So no, maybe we have to change the wax rim. Maybe we're coming out a little bit too much, or actually this looks pretty good, but maybe our lowers were coming out too much, and maybe we have to change the angle of our attack. So I'm going to go ahead and change that by utilizing the global transformation tool and just kind of making that change ever so slightly downwards. Okay, and then maybe just pushing it back just ever so little bit. Okay, but that allows us to go ahead and utilize that information that the doctor gave us to give us a little bit more room to manipulate our design, maybe prevent us from having to remove those individual teeth from the actual setup and fit a full set of teeth here. Alternatively, we do have other options within the virtual articulator that are very highly underlooked. The first one is going to be the settings that we just talked about. But the second one is going to be running through the actual evaluation of the protrusions and retrusions that we see with this case. Now, you can do it by guided by designs, which we're going to go ahead and do. And you can see if there's going to be any sort of interruption or areas that are going to be too contact heavy. And you can see here where those areas might be. And so we do have a good cuspid rise on this distal aspect over here, but it might be too heavy. We can see that we're not seeing too much of a rubbing. Maybe we are. So on that anterior portion, maybe there's too much on there and not enough cuspid rise on this one, it seems like. So maybe we have to build that out, and we can make those changes by going back into our design. You know, I'm going to use this arch transformation. I'm going to go ahead and see if I can't just bring this anterior back a little bit. It's a little bit sluggish. I do apologize. My computer's not the best at this, but maybe that was a little bit too much for this guy. Yeah, these changes are taking a little bit longer. The more I do changes like this, the more it's going to affect the speed or the quality of my computer. So I do apologize for that. I'm going to close this out, see if I can't get a little bit more speed from there. But just letting us know that we do whatever manipulations we change, we can see those active changes and how they operate within those individual setups. And then we can go through those excursions again and make those additional changes as need be. Okay. And here you can see that we do have, again, cuspid rise on this lower here, which is nice, kind of getting us there. But then as we go into protrusions, that's when we have that issue that I have with my setup. So hopefully you do a better job setting up your teeth with the tools that we have available to us so you can kind of avoid this situation altogether. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to talk about the gingiva design settings. So hopefully we've gone over everything. We have all the design tools that we have available to us. If you guys want to see these again, we can talk about that in the QA session afterwards. But I'm just going to go ahead and close out of this for right now. Actually, I'm just going to leave this open. So if we have any questions like that, I'm going to go over the gingiva design settings. So in the gingiva design settings, you have different opportunities to change how the gingiva correlates with your teeth, but also the individual aspects as far as customizing that the overall aesthetics of the design as well. So here we have some default settings that we have, which are going to be delicate, natural, or intense. So these are going to be like default settings that we have available to us. And in preview, you can see how that affects those individual aspects of the design and what that looks like. So you can kind of get an idea of a good starting point. But then we have sliders that are kind of hidden underneath it, which are the custom settings, which allow us to go ahead and formulate those settings a little bit further so that we can play around with these individual sliders to get a better result right off the bat. And what we can do additionally is if we find a good setting that works for us as far as the individual sliders go, we can also go into our control panel and customize settings here and create our custom settings that are a little bit more indicative of what we're looking for gingiva design and have that predicated so every case loads in with those settings just by clicking over here. And I'll show you how to do that in a second here. But the first one that we're going to talk about is the interdental papillae. This is basically talking about the individual length of the papilla as it relates to the interproximal context of the teeth. So how far up that papilla goes. If we go down lower, you can see that it's going to end up lower towards the bottom or the apical aspect of the tooth. If we go higher, it's going to end up more towards that marginal ridge. So I like it to be a little bit more higher. That gives me a little bit more freedom as far as my my sculpting goes. So it allows me to get a little bit more in depth. And it also is really good as far as the when you have bridged units. So these are all individual units, but if you have bridged units, that sort of that depth in between those pillars, in between those individual bridges, you want it to be as high as possible to get the maximum contact between those bridges. So if there's any sort of deviance of contact in those areas, it kind of allows for that space to be filled in by this gingiva here. Next, we're going to talk about the width, so how wide it goes. I like it to be low on this one. I don't like them to be as thick as this. So I'm going to go ahead and just apply these two changes that we've seen here. So it should bring these up a little bit higher, and it should make them not as wide or not as thick as we see them here. Just wait for this change to apply. And this is going to be one of the more heavier laden aspects of the design process. So the teeth is going to be pretty heavily laden on your computers, but this is going to be even more so heavily laden. So I do apologize if we run into a little bit of overlap here on our time, but maybe that was a little bit too much because that looks a little bit too sharp. So maybe I don't like that. Maybe I'm going to go ahead and bring it down a little bit and then make that change there. Okay, and then we have, next is going to be root eminence. So you have your thickness and your height. So that's how much a root is actually taking place in the actual design of the teeth. We don't see it too much on the anteriors, but you can definitely see it happening a little bit over here on the posteriors. That's the depth of that root eminence in the actual gingiva itself and how we can kind of create that to look a little bit more aesthetic. You know, if we just want it to be flat and plain, we bring these all the way down. That way there's no root eminence. It's just going to have a plain flat structure all the way across, sort of like an economy denture, versus having it a little bit high is going to have that more detail in between those individual areas. So I do like to have both of those a little bit higher, just because I know if I need to make any sort of change on this root eminence, I can do so really quickly with smooth, but I like to have that nice topography within there to give us a little bit more structure or a little bit more depth into our denture bases, especially with 3D printed denture bases. They tend to have a little bit less depth in the actual material itself, so I like to be a little bit more characterized with that goes. Next is going to be marginal thickness. So that's the thickness around here. You can see these are very heavy. I don't like it that heavy, so I'm going to go ahead and turn those down a little bit. Actually, they are turned down, so I'm going to turn it up, maybe a little bit up. So that's actually not the thickness, it's the overall aspect here. See what that change looks like. And it's just basically changing the aesthetics to what you guys are looking for, what you guys like. And then we can make these customized settings for every single case going forward. So you don't have to play around with it anymore. You know that this is going to be successful, the case that you're looking for. We can make that change in the control panel. And I think the reason why mine are so flared out is the actual edge shape profile, which is this aspect over here. Okay, so it did beef it up a little bit more, kind of gave it a little bit more of a cutback underneath that gingival aspect, which is nice. You know, I still think those are a little bit too prominent for my liking, but we can go ahead and change that afterwards. But the last one is going to be the head shape profile, which is the base thickness down towards the bottom here. So here we can see if we hover over this, it basically tells us what that edge looks like. You know, if we go down towards the bottom, it's going to be a little bit flatter. If we go down towards the higher end, it's going to be a little bit more sharper. So I like to be somewhere in the middle there. And then hit preview. Okay. After we've done these base settings, we can then change it a little bit more in depth by going to the wax knife or going to the sculpting of the denture base. And this allows us to do more characterization as far as that goes. Just wait for this to change a little bit here. So I actually might write down these settings here as my individual, so I'll know exactly what I'm looking for. So here we can see is all the way over. And then we have one off from the left. And then we have all the overs next to. And we have two off from the left and then one off. And then right in the middle. So I just wrote those down just so we have those, so we can show you exactly where to change that, so we can have a customized template going forward. So after we've done that, we can do the same thing to the mandibular base as well. Have those settings up. The next thing that we're going to talk about a little bit later is talking about thickness and relief. We'll talk about that in the fitment and the settings. So next would be sculpting. So this is just the initial setup of those settings. Next is going to be the actual sculpting of those settings, or sculpting of the denture bases and whatnot. A lot of waiting to do with this, but I appreciate your patience. And once we get through this portion, it should be a little bit faster here. So in the sculpting denture base, this is where we can go ahead and make our finite changes that we want to our denture base. I always turn off the minimum thickness because I never believe that. I always just, based upon what feels right, and go from there. But if you ever have any doubts, you can utilize this to show you any areas that are too thick or too thin. And then I just ask you to increase those areas. So the first thing I'm going to tackle, if I see this too much, I'm going to utilize my wax knife here. I'm just going to go ahead and utilize this to kind of smooth up those transitions with the smooth tool to make it a little bit less prominent in those areas. And then these anterior areas, I'm actually going to add a little bit more because it seemed like it took away too much. So I'm going to get a smaller circle, just go ahead and click. Bring that out a little bit. And get that design looking nicely. So here you can make those finite changes based upon what we talked about with those settings. The default settings give us a nice starting point, but here we can go ahead and be a little bit more precise with our changes based upon the customization that's available to us with this wax knife. Okay, so again, just kind of smoothing this up here and going around here, making sure that this looks exactly how I like it to. I think this looks a little bit too sockety-ish, I guess you'd say, for my liking, but I'm just going to go ahead and, for the expedience of time, just kind of move along here. We do have options additionally in the wax knife settings or in the sculpt toolkit to add stippling, which is a nice feature that allows us to go ahead and create a nice feature on this aspect here. I'm going to go ahead and choose the, I think it's the medium type 1. And we'll go ahead and choose this, and this allows us to go ahead and add some stippling on here. Okay, and wherever I highlight in red is going to apply that stippling. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play. And you'll see that it adds the stippling on here, gives it a little bit more characteristic, like we talked about with 3D printed dentures. Getting that sort of characterization or getting that breakup of the light allows it to be a little bit more characterized. And then what I do is, because this does tend to look a little bit too veiny, I guess you'd say, I take the smooth tool, and the biggest circle that I can, I just go ahead and I smooth it up a little bit. So it's a little bit less intense, but we still have the makeup as if we did our own festooning on this area. Okay, just going by and smoothing a little bit doesn't make them disappear totally, but still gives us the idea that we have this customized feature on these individual dentures. And that just takes about 10 clicks or so to get done. And now we have a nice detailed aspect on our denture. Additionally, at this time, we do have an opportunity to add, for those who are 3D printing, some manufacturers require you to add the support bars as far as your denture bases go to prevent any sort of warping or anything like that during that setting. So at this point, what we would do is we just go ahead and we're going to go to either attachments. We can either do cylinders or we can do bars. I like to do cylinders just because it's a little bit easier to do. And what I do is the default orientation, I'm going to set this up to be a view direction. And so my first view direction is I'm going to go ahead and look directly on the side. I know I want it to be a little bit more inside here, but I'm looking from this side because it's easier to manipulate as far as design goes. So I'm going to click to add my support here by clicking on the plus. Maybe that's way too big of a cylinder. I'm going to do a 2mm cylinder here. Do it by view direction. So I'm looking directly at the back molar here. and you can see I've added my piece here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lengthen it by using the green dot. And then I'm just going to pull it through. Actually, you got to utilize this spiky dot here that might not be available to us right here. I'm going to go ahead and pull it through all the way over here so that it comes through the back of the tooth. All right, and it sits just below the tooth, obviously not touching the tooth, but touching the denture base and going through there. The last thing I want to do before I set this in place by hitting the play button is I'm going to remove my model here. I'm just going to make sure that it's not sticking too far low, that it actually comes through. So if I brought this too far low down, you'll see that it actually ends up in between here. And that's not going to be successful because then we'll have artifacts on the underside of the denture base, which we don't want. So I'm just going to go ahead and make sure I bring this up. And I'm just going to support it probably about 2 millimeters or so from the edge. Oops. I just deleted it. There we go. I'm going to place it 2 millimeters or so from the edge. Next, I'm going to do my next one, which is going to be usually located around the first bicuspid here. Again, I'm going to elongate it with the green dots. And if you notice, there's a little spiked ball here. You can't really see it if I'm zoomed out all the way, but if I zoom in, I can left click and drag this over. And this allows me to transfer this bar into the inside of our arch. All right, that might be a little bit too long, so I'm going to go ahead until I can start to see it come back, and then until it just disappears. Again, making sure that it's not coming through the bottom there. If I wanted to rotate this so it's a little bit more parallel, I can do so, and then I can bring it a little bit more forward. Like I said, I like it to be right in between those, more on the first bicuspid, but maybe I can place it on the second one, right here. And lastly, what we like to do is rotate this down so it's parallel with this one. Lastly, what we like to do is just add another bar just going straight down from here all the way to the bottom. So again, just utilizing that view direction, I'm going to go ahead and look at it from the top. All the way up about halfway. And then I'll have to move it with the spike dot here. Okay. Just placing it like that. So now we have our good support there. I'm going to go ahead and hit the play button. And this just combines the attachment with the denture base. So if I didn't like that bit there, if I wanted to, I can go ahead and even smooth that aspect too. So the smooth tool will work on the attachments that we've added to the denture base as well. Okay. I'm going to take a little trying back and forth, but you can go ahead and smooth that out as well. But there you go. There we have the manipulations that we can do in the denture base gingiva designs. Okay. So next, what we're going to do is, since we're in this step, we're going to talk about the coupling mechanism. So coupling mechanism is obviously how the teeth integrate into the actual denture base, and the differences that we have here. When we do this, we don't want the coupling to go into each other because that's where we run into errors as far as the coupling goes. And if we run into errors, it's not going to allow us to push forward. So always what I like to do is I like to make sure that we maintain more of a vertical if we can. Specifically with the anteriors, we like to be a little bit more vertical with our coupling. And then you can see each individual one just go straight up and down and move on. Oop. Don't click on that button. That just brings us back to the beginning. I'm going to have to click next a bunch of times here. But essentially, with the coupling mechanism, the biggest issue that we see is obviously the errors saying that the coupling is intersecting areas that can't work. So when we look at that, what we want to do is we want to make sure that our teeth on the anterior are not so being coupled back out towards the buccal aspect, but actually a little bit more direct up and down. And then with our posteriors, we want them again to be up and down, but we don't want them to be leaning a little bit too mesial as well. Now, if we have bridges, then that runs into a little bit more difference as far as changing the coupling because we have different insertion paths for 3 individual bridges or 1 individual bridge if you see that. One bridge, one giant bridge, we won't see any errors because it's all one cumulative coupling going in at the same time. But the smaller bridges tend to be a little bit more of an issue as far as adjusting those settings to kind of eliminate that sort of crossover between those coupling insertion directions. apologize here again. Denture base is going to be the most time consuming time, especially with all the individual clicks that we did and the customization that we did. It's going to take a little bit longer to kind of replicate and push forward here. This one we didn't do anything on the denture base lower because I just wanted to push through it. So it should be a little bit faster, but again, it's going to be the most taxing on our design systems that we have here.
Here's a quick poll while we're waiting. It says, are you currently outsourcing any of your denture designs? If you wouldn't mind answering either yes or no.
I don't know if it's just me, but it's just the first poll here.
You're not seeing the outsourcing?
No, I see the pro tip. Which one are you more excited to learn about?
Yeah, people are answering.
Oh, maybe it's just because I didn't answer the first one that it
Yeah,
showed me the first one
probably.
again. Tell me to do the first poll.
Okay, great.
All right, so yes, going back to the coupling mechanism. With the anteriors, we do want them to have a little bit more of a slightly more buckle as far as that goes, but not too much that it's going to actually impede the papilla design. Because when we do push the coupling to be a little bit more facially, what happens is you tend to erode away the papilla on that surface because you're actually incorporating that insertion direction to kind of be along that area that we just kind of built up with that papilla design. So you have to be very careful with these. So here you can see it's a little bit more facially. I do like that angle. That's not a bad one. But just to preserve more of that papilla, I'm going to go ahead and bring it a little bit more straighter. Okay, more up and down. And those are just typically on the anteriors. But the same goes with an anterior bridge as well. You want to find the happy medium where you're not going so far out. And you always want this to be as straight up and down as to the long axis of the tooth as possible. So like something like this would not work because it's not successful. You want to be as long as you can here. And these, again, you want to make sure that you're finding the same sort of long axis of the tooth, more straight up and down. And doing this not only helps us to get a good grasp on the actual coupling of the teeth into the denture base, but helps, as you can see here, helps to alleviate these errors that we might see where the coupling path intersects a neighboring tooth and thus gives us those errors that we're so prone to. Okay? More towards the long axis, a little bit less facially in the buccal points. Okay. So the last thing that we have to talk about is going to be the fitment or the manufacturing settings. And this has to do with how the actual the denture base is being manufactured and what settings we do to kind of either increase those settings or decrease those settings and what changes we can make in the denture design software to get those areas. So here you can see I actually ran into an error with this tooth because it was too far here. So I'm going to go ahead and go more straight here. Preview what that looks like. Now we can go next. So talking about the fitment settings, based upon what we selected in the order form, whether you're printing or you're milling, is really going to determine what the settings are going to be like. Here we can see that we have the minimum thickness underneath the teeth, which is talking about the distance from the underside of the teeth to the actual the minimum thickness that it needs to be. So if we have our jars are a little bit closer together and we don't have as much room, what it's going to do is it's going to sacrifice the underside of the tooth to increase the thickness of the denture base. But we need to make sure that that denture base has at least 27 millimeters of thickness underneath the teeth. So if we don't have a lot of room and we run into an instance where that 27 millimeters might impede on the actual design of that tooth, we can either A, ask a doctor to open the bite to allow us to customize that design and allow us to go ahead and incorporate that last tooth in there. B, we could remove that last tooth in the design settings, the tooth manufacturing, the tooth setup section. We can remove that tooth. Or B, we can come in here and we can change the minimum thickness underneath that tooth, knowing that we're going to be combining that tooth with the denture base, so long as the overall size of that tooth isn't going to be below the manufacturer's recommendation of the overall thickness of the denture base. And so here we can see, we're going to go ahead and bring that down to about 0.2. And that just kind of allows us to keep more of the dentition of the tooth in there rather than sacrificing that to meet the minimum thicknesses of the denture base. With printed dentures, where you have the printed teeth and the denture base are both being printed out of the same type of material, you typically don't have to worry about that nearly as much. But where we're having two different types of systems being involved, whether it's milled teeth and a printed denture base, or carded teeth and a milled denture base, what have you, any sort of combination of that, this is typically where we're going to have to run into that instance of what takes precedence, whether it's a tooth material or it's a denture base material. And then being able to recognize that the minimum thickness is up to the manufacturers, they might have us go to 0.25, 0.5, whatever, but you have to make sure that we have that minimum thickness underneath the tooth to support the tooth into that indication there. Next, we're going to talk about drill compensation. Drill compensation is only found on denture bases that are going to be milled. So if you know that your denture base is going to be milled, you need to have that over milling in certain areas that aren't going to be reached by the smaller burrs. And that's just basically alleviating those areas. So if it's not going to be able to mill it out with that small burr, it's not going to go ahead and create something that's not going to fit on the actual denture base. Typically, I don't see the need for this a lot because we don't have a lot of sharp bridge lines. So, we're not seeing a lot of that being a kind of impedance as far as that goes, but we do want to make sure that we don't have any unmillable areas in our denture design. So just being sure to check that off allows us to kind of incorporate that sort of safe guide in our design to prevent it from being an issue later on down the road. And the last one that we're going to talk about is the glue space, which is talking about the interaction between the tooth and the denture base here. Okay, so here we can see that right now the tooth hasn't been selected out, but if I go ahead and let's cut that again. If I go ahead and I preview this, we can see that it's going to cut out the tooth in relationship to the actual denture base. And we can change that overall glue spacing based upon what you guys feel comfortable with. Typically, a 0.17 is set up by the manufacturer, so that is going to be detailed per those individual manufacturers. We do have hanging teeth somewhere instead. Hanging teeth relatively means that there's no tooth touching or interacting with the gingiva, so I don't see any on here, but it might be on the. It's over here. But as I was saying, sorry, this error threw me off a little bit, but it's okay. It's good that we saw this error as far as what I'm concerned here. So I'm going to lower that glue space and see if I can reduce the amount of space in between the interaction of the tooth and the denture base. Now, a lot of these settings, as I said, were predicated by the manufacturers. So they have like these indications as far as what they expect the minimum spacing to be successful with either their bonding agent or their fusing agent, whatever they call it. So we do want to make sure that we're following those specifications. But if we do run into issues like this, where it's asking us to alleviate hanging tooth in this instance, where it's something that's not penetrating the gingiva as much as it can be, it says tooth number 5 is not. So I'm going to look at tooth number 5. This here real quick. Might have to build up on my gingiva, just go back to a step where it says sculpting the denture base, just kind of build up on this area a little bit. Same thing on the other side, just be safe a little bit. Just kind of sculpting this up a little bit. Give this a little bit more depth. And hopefully alleviate that design issue. But that glue space is basically going to be, like I said, how closely the fit between the tooth and the denture base is going to be. So with this one being Dentsply Sirona settings, we're going to leave them as is, which is that 1.17 for that glue space. Hit preview. You should see a nice small space develop around the actual teeth here. And it's basically just a socket space. It's basically allowing the filler to kind of be in there, similar to the cement space on a crown relative to the die. If you guys are running into issues where it's impeding the accuracy of the fit of those teeth into those sockets, like they rock too much or they don't have enough fit, maybe reducing this number to get a more intimate fit allows us to go ahead and correct that aspect. But you have to realize that the amount of liquid that you're using for bonding these agents together is going to be less. So whether you're reliant upon that bonding agent to form mechanical bond as opposed to a chemical bond, really is going to be indicative of the success on this number here. So if we have PMA teeth with a milled denture base or a printed denture base, you're going to run into an issue where we're not relying so much on the chemical bond, we're relying on that mechanical bond. And that glue space, even though it makes a nice intimate fit with our teeth, might not be strong enough for our denture to be successful. So you have to be careful and kind of playing around with those areas there. And we're almost done here. Okay, and then we can see the individual settings there. Again, because I chose drill compensation, we can see that it kind of milled out this area a little bit exceptionally because we needed to make sure that it was going to be able to mill there. If I go ahead and add preview without that, it's going to be a little bit more direct to the form of the actual individual teeth. And that's why I gave us that hanging there before. The hanging area that we just saw basically says that there's no sort of coupling in this area. So it's basically with the drill compensation, it was out to almost nothing. So there would be no sort of socket as far as the buckle is concerned on this tooth. Okay. So that is just about it. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
We do have a couple of questions. So the first one is, how do we set the occlusal plane without a bite registration from scan sent?
So without a bite registration from scan sent, you typically have to have something that the doctor used to record the bite as far as the relation between the upper and lower jaws. So if you're working on existing dentition that he wants to do an immediate denture on, typically what he'll do is he'll close the bite and scan that as a bite, and essentially just utilize that kind of individual transformation between those two teeth to kind of find out that occlusal plane. But if he doesn't, if he uses just like a generic scan of the upper and lower, there has to be some sort of registration of that bite for him to know the distance between those two, and we can utilize that as a wax trim. So we can either go through the scanning process where we import the scans that he sent us and then scan that registration separately and align the two together. 3Shape has a good opportunity where we have that option to kind of incorporate a wax trim after the bites have already been, or after the arches have already been scanned. And we can kind of coordinate those two together. So align the underside of bites to the top side of the arches and get those two made up so that we have a nice relationship between the arch and the registration, and then basically use that registration. Otherwise, it's just utilizing that wax rim that came with the case to kind of find that sort of happy medium. So it'd just be something like this, that we go ahead and we choose 3 individual points, one on this, one on the posterior, one on the central, and one on the other posterior, just kind of find that alignment in there. But if you saw with the other case that I did close out of, which had the existing teeth, you can actually use those existing teeth to find your midline as well. I hope that answers that question.
Michael wants to know, how did you bridge the teeth?
So in the order form, you have to bridge the teeth. This one is set up not as bridge teeth, but as individual teeth. In the order form, if I can go open up my 3Shape here, in the order form, what you have to do is you have to go through and choose what kind of teeth you want to bridge out and how you want to section those bridges. With the copy denture workflow, it kind of has a predicated aspect as far as when you scan your denture, it segments the denture based upon the different options that it has, like an individual option, a full single bridge, or quadrants, or anterior and two posterior bridges. That is set up in the design software. But when you're designing a denture from scratch like this, we have to determine where those bridges are going to be set up here. So if I'm just going to clear all here. If I select my bridges, what I'm going to do is I want to select whatever bridges I want to go up to. Typically, I like to do the 6 anterior together. I'll go to my gingiva first. All right, and then I go to anatomy, and I'm going to hit bridge. All right, that sets this one up as an individual bridge. Now I can do the same thing here. I'm going to go to gingiva, anatomy, and then bridge. And the reason why I kind of do it backwards is gingiva, then anatomy, and then bridge, is because if I go to anatomy first, it assumes that I'm going to be doing crown and bridge, and I have to manually change it to artificial tooth. Then if I go to gingiva, it's going to select the dentures gingiva automatically because that's the first option. Versus if I just start, I'm just going to clear this real quick. If I make my selection and then go to gingiva first, it automatically selects dentures gingiva. And then when I go into anatomy, it automatically selects the anatomical or the artificial tooth aspect. So it's a little bit faster, a little bit easier. And then the last aspect is to make sure that these bridge together. So I'm going to use the bridge option. So our order form, we select the teeth, then we select the gingiva, then we select anatomy, and then we select bridge. It's also important at this time that you choose the correct material and manufacturing process. So if I was going to be doing Dentsply Lucitone digital print, I'm going to choose that and make sure that my manufacturing process is printing as well. Okay. Same thing. Once I choose that, it automatically changes my teeth as well to being the same thing. Okay. So I could change this also to denture resin if I wanted to, whatever. Okay, but you need to make sure that you have your setup correct, so your arch and your bridge is set up correctly, and also your materials and manufacturing process is set up correctly. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah, so Michael has a second part to his question. He wants to know if you have to set an insertion pin for each tooth if the posteriors are bridged.
No, you don't have to have an insertion pin. So that's really based upon the individual libraries, whether you have carded teeth is going to set up the insertion pin, but the insertion path that you go to is determined by that coupling path. So even though we have the default setup as far as our occlusal plane and our sagittal plane, what's going to do is it's going to go ahead and assume the coupling path. So going back to that coupling step, we have to make sure that that coupling path is more direct down towards like the insertion path would be for that bridge to enter into the socket. Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for all of your questions, everybody. We really appreciate it. I just want to let you know on the 2 last polls that I launched, I'll be giving you guys a call and, if you've answered yes to any of them, and to just go over specifics with you and find out like what your needs are and what you'd like to do. My name is Fran and I am the education manager, and I am here to help with anything that you all need from any of these webinars or any of our hands-on courses. I just want to let you know what's happening next week on Zahn Academy. We have Jimmy Stegall presenting on 3D printing in the lab from basics to breakthroughs. So we'd love to see you next week. Please, registration is open for that. So if you're interested in seeing the course, go on in and register. And I hope everybody has a wonderful, wonderful day. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you, guys.